Hello, welcome to another Tweedy Pubs video. I am back in Holborn again, an area you might want to call Holborn. You'd be wrong apparently. I have been here before. I featured some of the big hitters in one or two previous videos. Already been to the City of York, already been to the Old Mitre, already been to the Seven Stars, but Holborn is such a gold mine that it deserves more than one visit if you're only going to handle a handful of pubs in any one of those. So here we are again to see more of what Holborn has to offer. Cheers from the Princess Louise in Holborn. Most sources cite the building as dating to 1872, and this incredible opulent interior that we see today is a refit from 1891. It's almost certainly named for the daughter of Queen Victoria, Princess Louise, who was born in 1848 and died in 1939. She was married to the Duke of Argyll, the 9th Duke of Argyll, in 1871. So my guess is the naming of this pub in 1872 was probably in honour of that. Princess Louise was a patron of the arts and a talented artist in her own right. A statue that she made of Queen Victoria still stands in Kensington Palace today. As a coincidence, the wedding cake from her marriage to the 9th Duke of Argyll was described as curiously statuesque in the Strand magazine and was modelled on the statues on Holborn Viaduct, which is just nearby. Ruth Siddall has identified the granite in her superb publication on pub geology as Swedish Imperial Red and Imperial Pearl Larvikite. So a very regal imperial choice of granite. Historic England note that there are masks in the capitals of those columns. Pevsner was quite upbeat about the pub and describes it as an excellent 19th century pub interior, engraved mirrors by Richard Morris and Son, stained glass, tiles, etc. In the 1890s, the pub would originally have had partitions. They were removed at some point in the 20th century, likely the 1960s, which was a real nadir for pub interiors, sadly. But Sam Smiths, who took over the pub some time ago, reinstated them in 2008. So today we see the same layout with admittedly recreation of the partitions. However, much of the rest of the fabric of the interior is original from that 1890s rebuild. The bar back and the bar counter, there is a clock which is apparently of that period above the bar back. The bar back is the work of W.H. Lascelles, as is some of the stained glass, possibly those drama and music stained glass windows towards the back of the pub. A bit like the Argyll Arms, the corridors are perhaps where some of the best ornamentation in this pub lie. There's some beautiful coloured tiles of the era from the 1890s, a mosaic flooring and more brilliant etch glass. There is a publican's office behind the bar, and there are also Corinthian columns holding up the ceiling. Donald Stewart cites the men's toilets as being of such special quality that it has its own protection order. They are actually quite unusually mentioned in the Historic England listing for the building. They say that there are interesting contemporary gents WC in the basement with marble urinals and retaining some tiled walls and fittings. It's a Sam Smith's pub today, and we really have to take our hats off to them for this beautiful preservation and indeed the reinstatement of those partitions to give you that original Victorian, late Victorian era feel. They were obviously having a bad day in terms of beer supplies today. Both the old brewery bitter and the stout were off, so in terms of booze on the bar, it really was just a choice between lager and cider. I went for their Taddy lager. Absolutely beautiful interior, and it was very remiss of me to not feature this on my previous Holborn video. Next, the Ship Tavern. Cheers from the Ship Tavern. This, as far as I can tell, is an independent pub, which is a treat in London. And quite a nice selection of beer on the bar. This is from Otter Brewery down in Devon, I think it is, isn't it? One of my absolute favourite breweries, Otter. Treat to see that in London. The pub itself claims to have been established in 1549. It's a very hard to verify. It's even written on the front of the building, and it also says that the current building was rebuilt in 1923. It was almost certainly here in 1780 at the time of the Gordon Riots. A publication called The Lamp in 1857, and it says it was Mrs. Roberts that took the sacred plate from the sacristy of Duke Street Chapel, Lincoln's Inn Fields, when Lord George Gordon's rioters were trying to burn down the chapel. She took them to the priest that was hiding at the Ship Tavern at the corner of Turnstile, Gate Street, Holborn. So the pub was rebuilt in 1923. At that time, this was a William Younger's pub. And that's quite a rarity in London. William Younger's was an Edinburgh-based brewery, and I believe they only had a handful of pubs down here in London. You can still see the William Younger's brewery livery in the stained glass windows. More Scandinavian granite here between the windows. They are what look to me to be larvikite pillars. And also at the base underneath the windows, more larvikite. There's an unusual shaped pediment, if that's the right word for it, above the door, and the tympanum, if that is the right word for it again, in that pediment has plasterwork of, looks like an urn with possibly a fruit bowl at the top. And that's also flanked by these chains of bells, and you see those above the pillars around the pub as well. This isn't listed on CAMRA's pub heritage site, nor has Bethna said anything about it, so we don't really have a lot of sources to go on to understand better the date of the interior. I don't know, I mean, there could be some elements of it that are 1920s. It's a largely wood panelled interior. There are various knickknacks and things hanging from the wall, as you might expect for a pub named The Ship. There's a lot of shipping related memorabilia and models and prints and other pictures and other bits and pieces on the wall relating to ships. Various alcoves dotted around the ground floor bar. It was surprisingly busy today. I suppose we're in the run up to Christmas. It's a Thursday lunchtime. Is it quite early on at lunchtime? But good crowd in there today. Next, the Old Red Lion. Cheers from the Old Red Lion. There has been a pub on this site, roughly, of this name, possibly all the way back to the 16th century at least. You can clearly see it on William Morgan's 1682 map of London. It has a numbered entry, 355, and then in the legend down below it says the Red Lion Inn. High Holborn was originally the main thoroughfare coming out of the city of London, and at one time this large route would have been lined on both sides with inns parallel with Southwark. We see those famous old coaching inns like the George, the only remnant today, and the Tabard from Chaucer's day, and there was a similar cluster of them in this area of London in the Middle Ages. The Red Lion, the Old Red Lion as we see it today, is this tiny slender pub that just hugs on to a corner of High Holborn and Red Lion Street. Red Lion Street, of course, being named after the original Red Lion Inn, and that then leads on to Red Lion Square, also which takes its name from the original Red Lion Inn, and that was built on the site of Red Lion Fields, again coming from that Red Lion Inn, in 1684. Time for some pub bingo. Oliver Cromwell gets a mention here. There is an almost certainly apocryphal legend that the bodies of Oliver Cromwell and some of his cohorts were exhumed after the Charles II restoration around about 1661 to be possibly reburied in Red Lion Square or Red Lion Fields as it may have been at the time, and they were briefly put on display here at the Red Lion pub. Not sure if there's any truth in that, but it is recounted, the tale, in Old and New London. I'll put a link to that down below. The current building is very much late Victorian, dates to 1899. Ted Brunning in his book describes it as a plain but handsome red brick building. I think plain is almost slightly unfair. There is a little bit of ornamentation here, and I like the juxtaposition of this very sort of slender, thin building next to a much larger office block that is its neighbour. Mostly red brick. It has a striped gable. We saw this a couple of times the other day in Hoxton. There is a Diocletian window on the third floor, but it has 3 rather than the classic 2 mullions you'll immediately notice, of course. The ground floor frontage has yet more granite interest. There's some Swedish red granite at the base, probably larvikite pillars with gold painted Ionic capitals. There's a side door onto Red Lion Street which is now being closed off. Presumably that means that at some point there may have been separate compartments within the pub. It's all very much open plan now. Inside, it's interesting in that there is no seating other than stools on the inside. It's quite a small bar room, and it is very much designed for standing drinkers. Quite busy on my visit here today. The bar back, according to Ted Brunning, may well be contemporary with that 1890s rebuild. There is stained glass in the windows, which is obviously more modern given the Green King logos. It's a Green King pub today, but I do think they've made quite a nice effect with that, a nice sort of coloured light through those panes that comes through into the interior. Upstairs, Cromwell's bar. Pub bingo time. A much quieter space. I assumed it was closed or something. Everybody seems to be crowded in the ground floor space. Not much to write home about in the interior there either. The fireplace, possibly Victorian at a guess. Green King pub today. They had Timothy Taylor's Landlord on tap, in addition to a couple of other possibly more seasonal beers. So I just went for the good old Timothy Taylor's Landlord. So it's not perhaps in itself a particularly remarkable pub for the interior. Other than that, I think reasonably attractive bar back, which may well be contemporary with the 1890s rebuild. But I think it does say something quite interesting about the history of this area. It's hard to imagine that this was once awash with effectively coaching inns, a bit like Southwark. But we'll see more of that on the next pub. Next, and another example of a one-time coaching inn that ran along High Holborn, the Old Nick. Cheers from the Old Nick. This was originally named the Three Cups, and in that guise probably dates back to at least the 17th century. It is again mentioned on that map from 1682 as one of the coaching inns serving the route leading out of the City of London along High Holborn. And these would have been quite large premises, so this would have effectively been more or less a neighbour to the Red Lion, and they would have both had large yards with stables and facilities for the servicing of coaches. You can still get a little bit of a sense of it as a former coaching inn today, although this building is of course much more recent. There is an archway leading through to Three Cups Yard, which of course takes its name from the former name of the pub, Three Cups. The current signage is of course referencing the Old Nick as a nickname for the devil. And typically pubs called the Three Cups are a reference to the worshipful company of salters. Is that possibly part of their coat of arms, the Three Cups? The current building looks similar sort of age to the Red Lion to me. I would say possibly late Victorian, late 1890s or early 1900s. There's more of that larvikite, our favourite, at the base, the frontage on the ground floor, a combination of larvikite and Swedish granite making up the main trunk of the pilasters. There are four faces in between the first floor and the second floor, sort of almost slightly gargoyle-like, unclear what they are meant to represent. And the top floor has a kind of dormer window projecting with again a Diocletian window. On the interior, it's hard to say how much of it is preserved from that presumably late Victorian rebuild. The bar back just looks a little bit too thin and flimsy to me to be genuinely of that era. There is another piece of woodwork that's sort of strangely floating in the middle of the bar with a few stools along it and a phone charging station rather incongruously, that at least in terms of the design looks a bit more substantial and a bit more like the sort of thing you might expect to find behind a Victorian pub bar. There is what I assume to be an extension to the bar area towards the back of the bar that has a sort of cellar-like appearance with a curved ceiling. I do have quite a soft spot for this pub. It's very much a backstreet Holborn pub, bit off the beaten track, certainly not as busy as some of its near neighbours. As I've said in previous videos, I do have a soft spot for Hall and Woodhouse. They only have a handful of pubs in London, and this is one of them. This is their Badger's Best Bitter. It's a beer I've always quite liked. One last little nugget of history I managed to dig up looking at old newspaper articles. The Troy Coupian Chess Club. It's an odd name, but they base their name on this pub, which is where they had their meetings and played games. They used to meet here in the 1870s and 1880s, and there was a fun article about the decline in standards of chess players and some of the bad behaviour that they had exhibited up until that point. But I think this particular article was then singing the praises of the Troy-Cupian Chess Club, who had the right attitude, presumably. Next, the Dolphin. Cheers from the Dolphin. This is on Red Lion Street, and there is a fantastic cluster of pubs along here. We had the Old Red Lion down at the bottom, the Old Nick was only just off Red Lion Street, the Dolphin here, and then across the road the next pub. So a very short walk on this pub tour. This pub is most famous for having been the victim of a Zeppelin dropped bomb in World War I. Easy to forget that there were also bombing raids on London in World War I as well as World War II. It's sometimes stated that it flattened the pub, but looking at a picture of the pub, inside the pub, that recounts the damage that was caused, it looked more like it actually blew out the frontage, and the bomb probably hit just outside the pub, and it was the sort of shrapnel and the other effects of the bomb that caused all of the damage. So not entirely sure if the building was completely rebuilt. Looking at some of the internal fabric, there is a window leading up from the stairs that go down to the gents, and the framing around that just feels much older than that. Several people were killed in the blast, and famously, although much of the interior of the pub was destroyed, the clock was preserved and still today shows the time at 10:40 p.m, which was that fateful moment when the bomb dropped. And the name Dolphin, it's used in the coats of arms of two city guilds or worshipful companies, both the Worshipful Company of Fishmongers and the Company of Watermen and Lightermen have a dolphin in their crest or their coat of arms. So it may well be the case that this is originally a reference to one of those organisations. The earliest newspaper record I was able to find for the Dolphin on Red Lion Street goes back to 1754. Quite a sad account of a young girl committing suicide here. So this is a pub that has had many episodes of tragedy over its lifetime. It's a small pub, it's a wedge-shaped pub, as it is at the corner of Red Lion Street and Lamb's Conduit Passage. Inside it has a wonderfully old school feel to it. I don't know if it's exactly late 1910s, early 1920s, but it has some beautiful old reassuring pub features like a carpet and low stools. There are some partial partitions between some of the different seating areas, not the very restrictive high partitions of late Victorian pubs. Quite an imposing hardwood bar counter. Could imagine that might be 1920s, late 1910s, early 1920s. It has a very imposing gantry overhead, in particular, a very large gantry. There is a collection of pots, jugs, oil lamps and other knickknacks hanging up from around the walls and the beams of the pub. I think this is an absolute gem of a pub. The guy behind the bar, who said he wasn't the landlord, he was just helping out here, he said it was a Marmite pub. Some people will love it, some people will hate it. I love it. I'm definitely in the former camp. Very, very sort of homely, old-fashioned, old-school sort of pub. Landlord on tap. It's in good form, lovely pub, the Dolphin Tavern. Next, and spectacularly just across the road from the Dolphin, the Enterprise. Cheers from the Enterprise, just across the road from the Dolphin, probably the final stop on today's tour of additional Holborn pubs. This pub was originally called the Grapes. Sometime in the early 1900s it changed its name to the Enterprise. There are other pubs in London called the Enterprise, named after the steam omnibus of that name from the 19th century. Here though, given the signage, is almost certainly a reference to the doomed expedition to find the Northwest Passage across the Arctic, across sort of Canada, by Sir John Franklin. And the Enterprise was the name of the ship which embarked on 2 voyages to find any remnant of that failed expedition. I believe both were ultimately unsuccessful, but that mosaic on the side of the pub that attests to that derivation of the name Enterprise is recent. It's from 2006, that mosaic, and it's a work by an artist called Tessa Hunking. Camera have this pub on their list of historic pub interiors, so it's only the second today that gets a mention. They give it a 2-star rating, so it's quite highly regarded. I have to admit, I haven't really done my homework very well for this particular pub. Ran out of time a bit to do the research today, so I've just sort of showed up and I'm attempting to wing it. Not much written about specific dates, but this is almost certainly Victorian, obviously, by the look of it. And the standout feature, of course, is the beautiful tiling. To me, it has a kind of theatrical feel to the interior. The front bar, at least, has retained its Victorian fittings, both the counter and the bar back. Struggling a bit to find much more to say about the Enterprise, but I think the contrast between here and the Dolphin Tavern is really notable. Two very different pubs which will suit different tastes, I imagine. If you're looking for any post-pub sustenance, then the Friar's Delight behind me, 1958, originally opened by two Italian brothers. Very, very traditional fish and chips, and an absolute stalwart. The Enterprise definitely was officially the last pub on today's tour. I have covered the Old Mitre before in a couple of videos. That was weirdly at the tail end of Belgravia video. I've got the taste. Anyway, it doesn't matter. I'm planning a much more in-depth video about this spectacular pub, but I'm going to sign off from here. I'm going to have a beer. I won't talk about the pub today. I'll cover it in more detail on another video, because this is somewhere really quite special. So thank you very much for watching. I hope that tour of some of the, possibly, apart from the Princess Louise, possibly slightly lesser known pubs of Holborn was interesting, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye bye.